And I also wanted to note that this talk is given with the permission of the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, but any of the ideas within it, any interpretations, these are all solely my own. So first I'm going to launch into a little description of the site, kind of get you in place here, because I recognize that it's a bit of a black hole for basket maker and early Pueblo archaeology. These two sites are located along Orayvi Wash. They were sequentially occupied. They are adjacent to one another, separated. The communities are separated by about 3/4 of a mile. They date between maybe 600 and 750 AD on the basis of primarily Lino gray, Lino black on gray, and Talahogan red wares. The earlier of the communities is focused on a butte that's about 100 meters across and maybe 60 meters above the floodplain of Orayvi Wash. It's kind of located where a mesa comes out like this, pinches off, and then you've got this butte right on the very end overlooking the wash. Up on top of the butte, it's got very thin soil, but within it are about 25 or more small diameter cribbed log pit structures where you can see the slabs and such lining the outlines of them. On a bench below, there are 9 very large cists that I calculated would have stored enough food for about 80 to 100 people for a year. So basically you've got a community's worth of food storage up on this butte. And there are foundations for several large Hakal structures that are probably not habitations because there's very little associated debris with those. This butte top has controlled access. For being a basket maker 3 site that dates between about 650 to 700 AD, there is a lot of rock moving going on, and it appears to have some walls gating off access. It has 2 large megalithic stones that are about 2 meters high. We calculated they probably weighed up to 2 tons apiece that almost form a gate that you enter via a sandy ramp from the floodplain coming up to the top of this prominent butte. So all in all, a very impressive butte top complex. It's surrounded by a community of perhaps 12 sites within about a square kilometer. I estimated that the population of those 12 sites would have been about 60 to 90 people, so that matches very closely with the food storage capacity on the butte top. All the sites have intervisibility with the butte, so it appears to be a community focused on a prominent seasonal gathering place. And I think that the butte top itself is serving as a kind of communal architecture. There's no known great kiva or anything associated with it, but the very top of the butte, there's an area about 15 meters in diameter that's devoid of any architecture, which I think is actually being used as ceremonial architecture. The later community is about 3/4 of a mile away, and it's on a smaller, more restricted butte top that's kind of a little fin of cap rock that remains. And it has a fair amount of surface architecture that looks rectilinear based on the outlines of slabs. The architecture kind of came up and over the top of this cap rock and then down the other side, probably Hakal and adobe surface rooms. There's about 25 visible rooms that can be made out on either side of the cap rock, and there's room on top for another 25, and there are bedrock post holes up there suggesting that there was in fact some kind of adobe and post structure. So when you looked at it, you would have seen kind of a row of surface structures all along the top. There's the potential for 2-story architecture up against the cap rock based on the placement of viga holes that go up about 3 to 4 meters. And the entire complex is about 140 meters long. So I want to elaborate a little more on the main idea here. Now that I've kind of given you the outline of those are the 2 communities I'm working with. So we know that landscapes are extremely important. Regardless of how elaborate the material culture associated with those landscapes. I think Keith Basso's work on Wisdom Sits in Places that was describing the cultural landscapes of this very area around here kind of highlight that. I think that even the recent contestation over the Bears Ears National Monument shows how these landscapes continue to be places where people have values and meanings associated with them, and they can definitely get into arguments about how those landscapes, what the disposition of those landscapes and landforms will be. We also know that architecture is a powerful symbol. If we look at the way that we talk about Chaco and great houses as, seats of power or as, prominent places that would have been quite remarkable to experience as you're entering Chaco Canyon or approaching the Great House. We also work a lot with architecture and linking them to social groups where we can say, all right, this kind of structure probably housed X number of people. Their social organization may have been something like this. Now, I'm suggesting that maybe, based on the archaeology I've looked at with these two settlements, we can start to elide the notions of architecture and landscape. I mean, combining the two of them and saying, well, maybe sometimes landscape acts as architecture and other times architecture acts as landscape. This idea is kind of born out of some recent theory that people would refer to as the ontological turn, but it also comes a lot from indigenous archaeological theory, where the distinctions between cultural and natural are not nearly as well bounded as we would like them to be in sort of the Western world. There's good examples of these kind of places that act as architecture. I can think of a perched meander above the San Juan River that sort of forms a natural herradura for the river, and it's been marked out with shrines all over the place. Or the way that people often argue that the arc of cists behind basket maker habitations is kind of an homage to some of the earlier settlements that were in alcove spaces. So we can look at architectural modification of landscapes and landforms as a way of altering the meanings and values that are associated with those places. We may never know those meanings, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't assume that those places had meaning. And so this is manipulating architecture and landscapes is powerful stuff, and it would have been even in Basket Maker 3 and Pueblo 1. These people would have already had very highly developed cultural landscapes. They would have been very familiar and had deep experience with these locations. They would have had lots of values that were embedded within those landscapes, and any sort of alteration to them would be making a serious statement. So I want to return to the case study. These settlements, the earlier one that was on the large butte top and the smaller one that's on the restricted butte top, they were established in concert with landscapes that had meanings and values. The earlier butte top was a communal space, as reinforced by the storage features and the potential for using it as a ceremonial space. And the landform was invited into and incorporated into that community, as the viewshed shows. Now, the later one, some village segment appropriated a category of place, those butte tops, that had formerly been communal places, and they reinterpreted its meaning. They altered the community's ability to interact with that kind of an important and powerful place. The new architecture physically reinforced that. So in a way, it almost looked as if these new surface structures were part of the new butte top. I mean, think of the shape of sort of a rectilinear adobe structure marching across the top of one of these butte tops. And they closed down access to what had previously been an open access kind of landform. And I think that this manipulation of space, of architecture, and of landforms is actually an important part of the Basket Maker 3 Pueblo 1 transition that happens right around 750 AD. So real briefly, I'm going to go into the bigger picture here and say, where am I going with this? I think it's important to extend the idea of ritual landscapes that we've been using a lot in Chacoan archaeology back towards Basket Maker 3 and Pueblo 1. And there have been a lot of efforts already made in that, but I really would think it would be important to see, thinking about people trying to embed that sort of Basket Maker and Pueblo 1 research in a landscape perspective, where we recognize that they lived in meaning-laden places. I think that also I've noticed there's a tendency in Basket Maker 3 and Pueblo 1 archaeology, a tendency towards everything is always increasing sedentism, or greater investment in architecture, or bigger settlements. And it kind of makes Basket Maker 3 Pueblo 1 seem as if it's uncomplicated, that everything else after it is more complicated. And so we're surprised by things like early dates on macaws and fancy burials in Chaco Canyon dating from the 850s. Where did this stuff come from? And I think it's that certain qualities cannot be quantified precisely because they are qualitative. Things like meaning-laden landscapes and architecture fall into this. It's a resource of a sort. These landscapes and architecture are a resource that different social groups are manipulating and responding to like any other sort of resource they might be using. And so it was while I was working on these sites along Orayvi Wash that I really began to realize that thinking about how social power is related to and embedded in the manipulation of landscapes through architecture, that I really began to realize just why Basket Maker 3 and Pueblo 1 could be are so easy to see as precursors to things like the Chacoan world. And it looks like my time is about up, so I'm going to say thank you here, and it looks like there might be some time for some questions afterwards.